Okay, welcome everybody. I'm here today with members of the C++ and Debugger R&D team here in Scotts Valley. We've got Don Perchik.
Hello.
We've got Angel Martinez.
Hello.
And we've got Hin Bone.
Hi.
We're in this session today to talk about and take a look at the end about debugging C++ multi-device applications. And this is support that's included in our latest releases of C++ Builder Rad Studio and App Method September 2014 release. And so we're going to go through the different settings and setups and pieces and parts of everything that's involved in using the IDE to develop and debug applications. And then we're going to talk about how some of it works under the covers. And again, at the end, we'll do a simple debugging session of a one-button app, just to prove that it really works and that you get to do all sorts of cool stuff from the Windows IDE to the different devices, including Windows desktops, Windows servers, iOS devices, and Android devices, the 4 platforms, and OS X, the platforms that we support. So the first thing that I thought we'd talk about is if I want to do Macintosh OS X application development and debugging, what do I need to have? What do I have to install? What do I have to have on my computer? I guess I need a Macintosh, right, first?
Yeah, you need to have a Mac, and then you have to install the PA server on your Mac machine first. And then from your IDE, which is run in a Windows environment, you set up the remote connection profile that will allow you to talk to PA server on the remote side. And then that's pretty much it, so that your computer from Windows can talk to your Mac machine.
Yeah.
Well, you also need Xcode installed on the Mac side.
And in my case, on my machine, I've got a Macintosh MacBook Pro, and then I'm running Parallels Desktop 10. You could use VMware Fusion or whatever, a virtual machine. And I've got a Windows VM, in my case, Windows 8.1, but it could be Windows 7. I also, in my other office, I have a Windows 8 machine, a Windows 7 machine, so it doesn't have to be all on the same computer. You could have remote computers, right?
That's correct, yeah. As long as you have your PA server installed on your Mac machine from Windows, they will be able to connect it using like an IP address, so you can be anywhere.
And again, we have installation videos that are linked off the Welcome Start Here page that I recorded that take you through. After you've done the install of the product, then you go to the PA server subdirectory on the install and you copy that DMG file over to your Mac and install it over there, right? And again, the IDE, since it's on Windows, uses TCP/IP to talk to those connections over there. And maybe what I'll do is just switch real quick to the IDE. My IDE here, I've got these connections, and you can see those through Tools, Options. Let's see, the Connection Profile Manager. I've installed these different connection profiles, and in this case, for example, for OS X, I've got the IP address. Hopefully, it didn't change, but we'll see about that later. And then I also need to use the SDK Manager and connect to my Macintosh. In this case, I think I have, I'm still on Maverick, so I have 10.9.2. And that connection, once it happens and talks to the PA server on the Mac, right? And it pulls over, what does it pull over that the debugger and IDE
The SDK Manager, the purpose of it will be so that you can define, you can pull the SDK from your Mac machine so that you can use the header file and dilib file to compile your application. So that's what that's for. We don't pull everything from the Mac side, but we only pull certain files that we need. So that's what it's for.
This is how we create the native application for the OS X.
Is there debugging information that's included as well?
No, at this point it just purposes so that just pull the dilib information and the header information, no debugging purposes other than just for you to compile. That's what SDK is for.
So in my target platform and my project ID, I got a 32-bit, 64-bit Windows, an Android target, iOS. We'll get to Android and iOS in a moment. And again, I've got my OS X machine sitting over there. And if I go and say add a connection and click test connection, it'll say succeeded because over here on my Macintosh side, I've got my PA server running. So that's just the connectivity part, right? Ultimately, my app is compiled and linked in the IDE. The C++ compiler, Dawn, compiles, the linker links it.
That's correct. Yeah.
And then if I start a debugging session, the application...
When you hit debug, at that point, the application will be transferred over to the Mac machine using PA server, and then we will launch debugger on the Mac side. Then the IDE will talk to that debugger. Now you're in a debug session.
Okay. But as far as the developer is concerned, it's my C++ project. I'm just saying the target platform is one of the other machines other than Windows, right? In this case, OS.
You set up the connection profile, will tell you where your app's supposed to be running at on the remote side, and then that's it.
I mean, I know there's lots of C++ language things and compiler options and all sorts of stuff on, but as far as from a connector standpoint, it's an application gets built for OS 10. It gets sent over, and we can start running it and using it and debugging it right on the Mac.
Correct.
Yeah. And Angel, from a debugging standpoint, again, I'm in the ID and I'm using debug commands, right? Step, setting breakpoints.
Yes, all of that's, it's not dependent on what platform you're targeting. All that behaves the same.
Okay. And then for iOS, it's still the Windows IDE. I still need a Macintosh because the only way to get to my device, my iOS devices, is through the Macintosh, right?
Yes, your device is connected to the Mac itself, and then your development will be on Windows side. When you hit debug, we move your app to the Mac side, and we install onto your device, and then we launch your debugger from your Mac machine itself, and then we talk from IDE will talk to that Mac debugger kernel there, and then that talk to the device.
And I've got my iPad 4. It's connected through the USB cable to my Macintosh. So it from the Macintosh to the iOS device, the Mac is taking care of that, right?
Yeah. So when you run debug thing, actually there's a debug server running on your device itself, and then we do run the GDB on your Mac computer that will talk to your debug server on your device. That's how the debugging working from Mac side, and then from the IDE will have another connection through remote connection profile to send all the debug command to your Mac. That Mac will end up sending command to the server. So that's how it works.
Again, if I switch over to my Macintosh side, there's nothing really special here other than I've got the PA server running, and it has some commands that we can use. And then while I'm here, I'll bring up, there's my iPad running. I use an app called Reflector app. So that's pretty straightforward. And then besides Windows development and debugging, which we've been doing for years from the IDE, the next platform is Android Target. Android is a special case because in that respect, we have a Windows set of tools.
That is, the ADB is a tool from the Android itself, from Android SDK. Basically, that allows you to install the app to Android or to start the debug session, all this kind of stuff.
Is there and Angel, is there anything, again, from I guess I plug my USB cable in my Android device in Windows, and because the installed the Android SDK for Windows.
What you do have to make sure you have the drivers installed for your particular Android device.
Okay.
So you need to have that configured where your Windows machine detects that you have a portable device plugged in.
And again, turn USB debugging on, and you're going to tap 6 or 7 times in your
depends on the device. Some
version
devices
number.
are
and then turn on USB debugging, and I turn my stay awake while you're connected so it doesn't keep going to sleep on me, for example.
But all that's documented. So.
Yep. Over here in the IDE, I've got my Android node, and under the target, it shows my Nexus 7 is connected in the project manager. So it looks like everything seems to be okay. Under tools, options, SDK manager, I've got the Android SDK. That gets pre-installed if you choose to install Android.
Yeah, so if you choose to install it, all the paths are set up correctly for you. However, if you have one you already pre-installed, you have to set these up by hand.
Yep, and you can do that. You can just hit the add button, and you can choose Android or whatever, and you can then select the SDK and go and and set all the paths if you want to do that
Correct.
manually.
Correct.
Yeah, you select the SDK. I think it's also select. That's another area that allows you to select NDK, and then we will try to pre-fill everything for you, and then most likely we can detect what you have. We pre-fill all the other field for you.
For me, it just showed up because I said during the install, I want to install Android, and it set the SDK, the NDK, and where my Java runtime is going. And then I have this little utility which lets me view what's happening on my Android device. This is an Android screen viewer that Jim McKeith wrote in Delphi and using the FireMonkey. So there are many other utilities so that you can see, again, on the screen what's happening. So that's from a configuration standpoint. Again, you mentioned from the compiler standpoint, Don, this is the C++ compiler. This is the libraries that you use. This is FireMonkey multi-device, right? There's again, I think there's a BCC ARM compiler. Don, is that correct?
Yes, based on Clang.
Okay, so it's based on Clang, but it'll take the C++ language. It'll create ARM machine code.
Correct.
Yeah. And then on iOS and Mac, it's, let's see, on Mac, it's Intel machine code when you target OS 10. And again, it's ARM if you go to iOS, right? So how many I try to remember the number of compilers. There's 32-bit Windows, 64-bit Windows, C++ OS 10, that's 3, C++ iOS, ARM, which is 4, and then C++ ARM Android.
Right.
That's 5 C++ compilers. So I just wanted to reiterate, just as we talked about how many compilers there are for C++, I think there was 5 compilers. There's a lot of debugger technology that's included both in the IDE and along the chain of the connections that we saw. To use the integrated debugger, you need to, and this slide tries to talk a little bit about it, right? If you're doing Win32 debugging, you need a Win32 or Win64 operating system to run on, right? Our ID runs on is a Win32 app currently, but both of those, you can debug a 32-bit app on 64-bit Windows. You can debug a 32-bit app on 32-bit Windows, and the ID runs on Win32 or Win64. So everything's good, right? In the case of Win64, if you want to debug, you need to either have your machine be Win64, or you have to connect to do remote debugging to a 64-bit Windows machine.
That's correct. Yeah.
Right. For OS 10, you'll need a Mac, and again, the debugging bits are installed. I think, Angel, you mentioned because of Xcode.
Correct.
Xcode tools.
Xcode tools and command line tools.
Okay. And then for iOS, again, there's so the IDE integrated debugging goes through from the PA client to the PA server, which connects to the debugging on the Mac.
Yeah, so the debugger itself, okay, the server run in the device, and the debugger itself run on the Mac, and then from the IDE side, IDE will talk to that debugger on the Mac, and then that end up talking to the device. Just
as if I was a Mac only and iOS only developer, I'd have my Xcode and I would do debugging of OS 10 apps and I would do debugging of iOS apps. We're using our PA client in the IDE side to PA server to get to that same set of tool chains, right? To get to the debugger and then get to the device.
Yeah.
And then on Android, there's a debug server in the device, and then again the Android debug interface debugger is sitting there already installed on Windows, ready for us to do our job.
Yeah, because of that, we don't need any PA client or PA server whatsoever, because everything already on your Mac machines, on your Windows machine, we just use it. So
yeah, and it was set up again. All those links were set up when we added the Android SDK, which gave us the path to all the tools, libraries, SDKs, and so on. If we take a step back just again for requirements for multi-device debugging, as we talked about in the first couple of slides, you need a Mac if you're going to do Mac or iOS development. If you've got an Android device, you can do it all with Windows as long as you've set up through the install or by your own configuration the Android SDK. And again, making sure you have the connections where they're needed and setting up all those right SDKs for the different targets. This is, talks about, let's say, debugging a 64-bit Windows app, but in But in general, right, as we've been saying, if you've got regardless of what you're debugging, you're using the Windows IDE. You're setting breakpoints, you're stepping through code, you're looking at registers, you're looking in memory. One of the demos I do oftentimes is I'll create a Windows app and I'll set a breakpoint and bring up the CPU viewer. In fact, we can do that here, and let's set the target platform to 32-bit Windows. I've got a C++ app. I've got an event handler here that's just changes the text property of the button with hello. So I've got a window 32. I'll say run with debugging, which is this icon versus the run without debugging. And if I click the button, I'm at the breakpoint. This is the one that I think brings it home for me, is when I show this to people, because they wonder, Donna, are compilers generating like bytecode or something else? They're not, right? They're generating real machine code.
Correct.
So when I do this on a Windows, I point to people and I say, that sure looks like Intel instructions and Intel registers, EAX, EDX, ECX. If you bring up
Assembly,
your Intel handbook, right, you're going to see that kind of stuff. And the nice thing is that nowadays the Macintoshes also use Intel processors. So in some ways makes our life a little bit easier, even though the link format, the executable format is different.
Right.
But from the compiler and code emitter standpoint, again, using the compilers, it's Intel machine code.
Right.
Yeah. So that feels pretty comfortable to me. And then I'm not sure what to do, Angel, here. I guess I could either terminate, do a program reset, or I'll just hit run, and then the button changes to low, and that's cool. And then if I go and say, well, how about let's build an OS 10 application and set the breakpoint, and I run this application, run with debugging. Then I have my application. I click the button, and if I switch back to the IDE, I'm at the breakpoint. And again, if I say View, CPU, Windows, All, again, it's Intel code, Intel registers, Intel flags, and a bunch of memory, right? So that brings, again, home that it's native code. We're not generating some intermediate language or some bytecode or whatever. It's just the real machine code. It says hello, and the event handler fired. So then I'll go and I'll select the target platform Android, which will bring up my Nexus 7. I have my breakpoint. I'll say run with debug. The C++ compiler generates ARM code. The linker creates an Android application file. Mm-hmm. And it has now delivered that application to my Android device. You see it there with the button. So we can tap on the button. And here we are at the breakpoint. And then this is the thing that finally brings it home to everybody, whether it's an iOS device or an Android device. If I go and bring up the CPU viewer, I look at this and I go, well, those aren't Intel registers, and those are not Intel instructions. Those are ARM instructions, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Debugging in the IDE, are all the views the same? Maybe this is for Angel, I'm not sure. That you have the same functionality. There's all these different views of call stack.
Yes, you have the local variable view, you have the modules view,
watch
CPU,
window.
watch windows, all those are with every platform.
I guess we have some of those, right? This is my local variables.
Yes.
For whatever I'm inside of the event handler, in this case for the on-click event. Here's the watch list. I can go and add a watch. Right.
The evaluator, the Debug Inspector.
Let's see. Let's go look at all these. So there's the evaluator, evaluate, modify, if you're running a threaded application. So I've run the application on my viewer. The text property of the button has hello, but the application is still running, right? Mm-hmm. And I sometimes get confused. Maybe you can explain that since the application is still running, the debugger is still involved in the whole process?
Yes, the debugger is still currently attached to the running process.
So I have a couple options. I could detach from the application.
Correct.
I could
terminate.
Program reset or terminate it, right? Or the other way I noticed is I can go over on my device and hit that, bring up the application list and kick it out of memory, and it terminates.
Correct.
And the ID knows the termination through all the connections that it happened. And so now I'm back in my IDE, and the terminate button is not
That is
read
correct.
anymore.
Now you're ready to run another debug
Yeah.
session or tweak your code.
Yeah. Let's go back, for example, in the 32-bit Windows app and do a breakpoint. And here, some of the other views we can look at, for example, is we can look at the modules loaded. And so here we see all the different DLLs, right, that are part of my application and where they're loaded in memory and so on. What are some of my favorite views? The floating point. I don't know if anybody looks at those anymore, the FPU. And these windows can be docked as well, and you can save a different desktop. There's a default debug layout in the IDE, which is the view you see underneath.
If you debug multiple threaded application, the thread view will be very useful. So for on the bottom of your screen, so
Yep.
click on the thread, then you can see for when the process is suspended, you can see which thread in what state they are by seeing the call stack. So that might be useful.
I know you can also set, I love all the breakpoint options. If we look at breakpoint properties, you can put a condition, you can break in a thread. These are some of the other things you can do. Are all these advanced options, is all of this available for multi-device as
Yes.
well?
Yes, there.
So if I want to log a value, we did this many years ago as well. If I want to log a message into the message window and not break, or I might want to break and log a message or log a value of a variable.
Yes, that's a very useful tool.
Like for logging, just turn off break, log some expression, evaluate a variable, whatever it might be, or maybe do both. As far as exception handling is concerned, if an exception happens, it'll stop the execution, right? If I'm doing debugging.
What happened when exception being thrown, your process will be suspended, and then the IDE will notify you that in that state, then you can say you want to break, so you can see where you are at, or you can hit continue, just continue execution. So,
and I think there's an option to ignore an exception as well. There's certain exceptions that fire sometimes that have nothing really to do with what you're working on.
yeah, that's correct. You can set up the which exception you want to ignore. When that happens, when the exception being thrown, we just ignore you, so your program will continue running.
So then in each of these debug windows, I can also right mouse click, which is pretty cool. I can evaluate, I can expand like a pointer and walk down. I can, if it looks like it's something, I can go and inspect, and it brings up a Debug Inspector where I can see the fields and other parts of the instance of the object. And then there's some other options for debugging. Down here, we saw the inspector. I like to right mouse click on things and bring up inspect. But there's also inspect from the run menu. Evaluate, modify, I can put some expressions or variables in there, see their current value and give them a new value. You can add watches and breakpoints through here. I guess the other parts are the stepping. I haven't done anything with stepping because I was just being at a breakpoint and then hitting run after that. But you have all the choices of tracing into, so if you're calling a function, for example, to go from that line of code into the function entry point.
Correct.
I could go to the next source line. I guess I can run until return. So if I want to get out of a function.
Yeah, you get up to the function immediately. You don't want to keep on typing through the code before you exit the function. Yeah, you'll do that.
I can step over a statement. If I don't want to call into a function call, for example, I want to step over it and go to the next statement. After that, I can step over all of that. And there was program reset and then detach from program. And that just says that the debugger is no longer in the IDE, no longer is connected to the app, whether it's a Windows app or a device app.
Yeah, basically detach. We just detach from the debug session. That's all. And then your program keep on running, and then debugger just hand it off. So that's it.
Okay. There's also attached to a process. So if you start an app, like I know on Windows, I'm not sure about multi-device, when I would hit run instead of run with debug, I could terminate, go back. But on Windows, I know I could find the process and attach to an already running process. And if I have the debug information, I can start setting breakpoints and whatever it is.
That's correct. Yeah, but attach allowed you to, when your program is running, you can attach to it. So in this case, that program will be put into debug mode. But we only support that into, I think, Win32, Win64. But for the device, we won't do that. We don't support that feature. Yeah.
Okay. You can pass parameters to the application that you might have if it was a console application, but parameters and so on. So it's what's great for me is it's a very rich development and debugging environment with lots of compilers, and it supports all these devices, as you noticed in the thing. Is there anything else that developers should think about if they're doing multi-device as it relates to debugging? You can only debug one application at a time, one device at a time. We tell people if you're doing a multi-tier application, you run some of the pieces without debugging and then run with debugging the thing you're trying to debug.
Yeah. If you have if you want app depend on the other, you run one of them, you debug the other one. So
one of the things that happens to me sometimes is I do bad things in my code. I'm sorry. I'm just not as perfect as I'd like to be. And sometimes I get an exception where my application starts and immediately crashes. Like I did something bad, the first thing in my, like an on create of the application, for example, or I went to the main program and put some code in. So I don't really see anything. The app starts and it stops. And what do you do at that point? How do you know what happened with that when you ran an app?
You could start your debug session by stepping into. So start with, instead of doing the debug, the run F9, you could actually do an F7, which is a step into.
So I do a trace into right from the beginning. Right. Okay. And then I could see in the startup, in my starting code.
I mean, that'll try to get you to
application.
Go to your startup code, application startup code. And then if it died before then, now we cannot do anything. But you die right after that line, then you'll be able to stop there.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think, Angel, the one thing you told me, and the team keeps reminding me, if I also get an exception, and I'm not sure what it is because on the devices it shuts down, if I run with debugging, the exception will show up. It'll pop up in the IDE and show up in the message window. Is that correct?
It will pop up a dialog in the IDE.
Okay.
And ask you whether you want to break, meaning stop and let me look at the state, or continue, in which case, like if you have an exception handler somewhere, let the exception handler take over and continue.
So in all cases, if your app starts and crashes immediately because you just hit run, go back to the IDE, hit run with debug, or trace into and start stepping through, or just hit run with debug. You'll find out what that exception is. In my case, one time it was I had an invalid property name. It just was crashing. I didn't know, but then I got that exception. It said invalid property name, and it actually would give me the form file that it was trying to load and the property name. So again, for everybody, run with debugging. So I've selected the iOS device. That's probably the most complicated. I've got a Windows ID. I've got a Macintosh sitting there with PA Server, and I've got an iPad connected. So I'm going to say run F7, right?
Yeah, so there's no source code currently associated at that point. So that's why it loads up the CPU view.
Okay. So this is somewhere in the main program.
What code is
this is, I believe that's in the dilib. Basically,
you see
it's about to load your app. So basically, that will be the startup code.
So this is in the DYLD start is where it is, right?
It's the dynamic loader.
Okay, the dynamic loader. So if you're really not sure if there's something happening and you maybe put some code in the main part of your program that people usually don't do. I know I can say view source, and there's some things some people need to do some special code of some kind before the main initialize of an application object, the creative forms before the real magic is when you say application run. Some people have some need for some reason in certain application cases to do something before a bunch of other parts of their application works. Maybe they're initializing a port or something.
Initializing static objects, for example.
Yeah. So it's cool though that it did trace into it right from the beginning, and it's somewhere where I shouldn't be. And I know there's something else I can do. I think I can still do this. I think I can change the program counter as well. Very dangerous to do.
You can change it too, but it will be potentially your program might crash after that.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. Just like changing registers and things. I mean, ultimately. But then if I go in and run from there, then...
so it's running right now, so you switch over to the...
Just waiting for me to hit the button. And then it says that it's happy. So for me and all this debugging we've been doing and talking about the debuggers, these things are very powerful. What is it? the term from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. When you're in things like changing variable values, playing around in the CPU viewer, whatever it might be careful.
Yes.
Changing a pointer value, be careful. Mostly use the debuggers to see what's going on in your application, stepping through code, right? Is there any other advice that any of you have for developers who want to debug their apps? It seems pretty straightforward to me.
We try to make it very similar in terms of UI-wise between Win32 and devices, so make it as simple as possible. Of course, there will be some feature that's not available for device or for Windows, vice versa. So, but majority-wise, we want to make it as simple as possible, as if like in Windows app.
There's a new option. There's a couple new things in XE7. One, there's a new option. I think it's the R command, right, for resetting and terminating all child processes.
Yeah, the idea was when you run the iOS app, even without debugging, we will run your app. So that child process is running through PA server. So just in case, if you want to terminate the app on your device itself, you probably better to try run R first. In this case, we will terminate our connection with your device, so then you can move on with deleting your program from your device manually.
And so I hit R there, and my application went away. Right?
Yeah, that's correct.
That it was running. Now, another one that might be interesting for people, if you want to see what's going on between the IDE and the PA servers, to hit V, which is turn verbose mode on.
Yeah, when you turn verbose mode on, what we will show you will be all the command being done behind the scenes. So you pretty much can see what's going on. Yeah.
Go ahead, and there are other options here as well. I guess
I would be very useful, very handy, just in case you want to know what the port number to connect to. I mean, not the port number, the IP address to connect to. That would be it. So you don't have to run some config utility to find it out. So.
And then for doing all of this with PA Server, you can have a password if you want. You can change the port number. You have all these options from how the ID talks to the Mac, how it talks to the devices.
Yeah, you can use a password, or if you want, you can run in unrestricted mode. In this case, you can put the file anywhere you want and delete file anywhere you want. So, but by default, we make it restricted mode. So.
And for Mac and iOS, the S command tells you there's the scratch directory the PA Server uses, and that's where the application bundles are, and if you want to see where the apps are.
That's correct.
Yeah. So there's one other new tool that is part of the PA Server, PA Client world. That's called the PA Server Manager. What is that used for?
So the idea was you run this PA Server Manager, you should be able to run any instance of PA Server without have to modify the PA Server config file to change the port number. So using PA Server Manager, you can say, I want to name the name of the instance of this PA Server. You can set a different port number, and then you can change the scratch directory too, and then you just launch it. In this case, we'll launch a separate PA Server for you.
Okay.
And this is useful for teams that, if say people are sharing a Mac, and you have two developers, and you don't want to stomp on the work of someone else is doing. So then you configure this, and that way it makes it really easy to manage and start up and stop the instances of PA Server.
Okay, so then once I added that one, I can start one, stop one,
right.
Change the parameters, whatever it might be.
Right.
Because if multiple people try to go to the PA Server on the Mac, it's whoever's the most recent one. Is that right? If multiple IDs try to hit the same Mac device?
On the same port.
On the same port?
The same port, yeah.
But you can have multiple PA servers running on different ports at the same time?
That's correct, yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah.
So then the ID can talk to whichever PA server you want to. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I think at this point, I'll thank you all, and we'll switch over to doing Q&A. So let's start the Q&A session. You can use the GoToWebinar software to put questions in the question log for the team, and let's see what your questions are. Thank you again, team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So there's been some questions coming in. We've got Hin and Angel and Dawn are here with us. Kirill is on. Kirill, I'm going to make you, let's see. How am I going to do this? I'll make you an organizer. in case you want to type anything into the Q&A log. And you can raise your, I don't know how to raise the hand. Maybe there's a way to do that. But Carol, I'll turn on you as an organizer so you can see some of the questions just in case as well. And you can unmute your mic if you want to chime in. We've got all of that possibility. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I'm having to scroll back here. Just give me a quick moment. Okay. All right. Okay, so Phyllis was making a comment. She's getting the debug linker for doing iOS sometimes is stopping working, and she wasn't sure whether that was a hang on the Mac or through the IDE talking somewhere. And I think DSIM the debug linker is running on Windows, right?
Yes, it runs on Windows.
Okay, so if you're having something like that, Phyllis, the thing to do is log an entry in Quality Central, qc.embarcadero.com, and we'll see if we can help find a pattern that why the debug linker might stop working for some reason when you're doing iOS development.
With steps for reproducing, so we'll be able to try and reproduce it ourselves. Because as far as I know, we've not run into any such issues here.
Okay. And let's see. For Android, you said you enable USB debugging. Is this on the device or on Rad Studio IDE? Well, for the Android devices, you have to go to your setting. Oh shoot, where's my Android device? You go to your settings and you go down to information about your device, and then you go to the. So let's see. I can never always remember. I just sort of go around. You go to settings, general, about, and then on about you go down to the. What is it? It's the version, I think. The version.
This is depends on the device. So,
okay.
So steps will vary depending on what you're using.
Yeah, and you tap 6 or 7, some number of times
for the build number, and then
for the build number. Yeah, and then that's what enables debugging, and then you need to go over to then a developer. Okay, so then the developer settings will show up. Let's see.
And then you could turn on debugging.
And then you can turn on USB debugging. So if I go about, and I've done this, so.
But a quick Google search on your device, a specific device, will
tell you the steps.
Will tell you the steps. So.
Yep. And then once you turn on, you get the debug settings. I turn on USB debugging, and I turn on stay awake, stay alive while I'm connected through USB, because that way my screen doesn't auto lock and shut off when I'm in a debugging session. Since I'm connected through the USB port, I'm not going to run out of battery for my Android devices. So on the IDE side, what do? You just set the platform, right? You say, I want to build an application for Android. I want to do debugging for Android. As long as you have the right configurations that we showed.
Based on the IDE, just make sure the configuration is set to Android platform, and then you just hit debug. I mean, assuming everything the Android configuration is set up correctly, then you just hit debug. It should work by itself.
Yeah. Hit step, run with debugging. And then there's you need to go ahead, Angel. We talked about that a little.
You need to make sure your computer that it's plugged into your Windows machine recognizes your device, and it shows up under devices under portable devices. So you have the correct drivers installed.
And then in the IDE, when you have the target platform, you'll see the devices show up. If one doesn't show up, you can right mouse click and choose refresh.
That's correct.
In the project manager, right?
Yeah, in the project manager, you hit go to that Android platform, then hit refresh. The device should show up. If it doesn't show up, that means something else is wrong. Yep.
And Phyllis was asking, can you step into FireMonkey and RTL source code while you're you're using the debugger in the ID and you're debugging an Android or iOS device?
Yes, you just basically hit step into. You need to have use debug DCUs enabled, and you need to have the correct path to the sources.
And Kirill also typed in, just as you're saying, try to build your app with the debug versions of the FMX and RTL. And I guess if the source path is correct, if it can't find a source file, what happens here?
If the source file is not found, we'll prompt you with the location. The dialog asks you to type in the location of the source file. The key is when you build your app, the RTL debug version of the code should be linked in this case by marking the debug DCU on. By doing that, now we have a debug information. So when you step into, we will prompt you for the source code if we cannot find your source.
And again, you can step into, and if it has the source code, then it'll step from your application code into a FireMonkey method or an RTL function or whatever, and you can then step through the source code. If you don't have source code, maybe you have third-party components or third-party library, and you don't have the source code, what'll happen in the IDE?
It will bring you to the CPU view, because if you don't give me the source code, the CPU view will show up for you.
And I love that. Then you get to step at the machine, the compiled and or optimized machine code, and look at registers. But sometimes you might find some information. You might see maybe you're passing a bad parameter, or you've got some bad pointer or something like that, even if you don't have source code. But always better to have the source code. Absolutely. Ahmed was asking, he's in the ID and he's debugging applications, and he gets an access violation at some address, and we were sort of wondering and asking, was the access violation in the ID, or was the access violation in your code? Is there a way to tell him?
Yeah, when you debug an app and then debugger control your application. So in this case, when exception is raised by your application, the dialog will show up, unless you have you set up in the IDE so that any exception like this, I want to ignore it. By default, all the exception will show up. In this case, you have a dialog. Will ask you to continue, or you can continue or hit break. So if you hit break, we will attempt to show you the location where this thing happened, and either CPU view if you don't have a source. If we do have debug information, we'll show you the location where in the source code.
Yeah, and this dialog window is titled Debugger Exception Notification.
Okay, when it's in your code.
Correct.
Yep. And so Rob is asking, do we have any tips for finding places where he's using a deleted object? And for Win32, we have technology still available from years ago called CodeGuard, and you can turn that on if you're doing Win32, and it generates all sorts of guard bytes and other things around things. It looks for bad calls to Windows APIs and for use of memory that you don't own, things of that kind, and it'll pop up. But that's Win32 only, right, Dawn?
Correct.
Yeah. So CodeGuard, we have third-party technology partners. SmartBear has automated QA, and again, that's for Win32 and Win64. I'm not sure if they've done things for other platforms. And automated QA, which is if I'm saying the right, I'm saying the right product. They have a plugin for the IDE, and it will check for bad parameters and use of bad memory and things of that kind. So you might, if you're doing Win32 with C++ Builder, turn on CodeGuard. It'll catch a bunch of stuff, but it's Win32. If you're doing Win32 and Win64, then check out automated QA. Those are two options. This is probably for you, Hin. Can we run multiple PA server versions on the same Mac? For example, XE5, XE6, XE7.
Yes, you should be able to run multiple versions, except that you might want to have a different port for each PA server, because otherwise you get a port conflict. So basically, you can say PA server 1, basically using default port 6, and then for the other PA server, you have to set a different port. You can modify that through like a PA server.config file, or if you run PA server manually by hand, PA server, you can say minus port equal to whatever port number you want to use. Yes, you can do both.
And what I have on my MacBook Pro is I set up aliases on my desktop pointing to the different versions of PA Server so I could start them. The new PA Server Manager that we demoed that's new in XE7, can I set up multiple versions of PA Server in the manager as well?
Yeah, the PA Server Manager that we have basically allowed you to define a different PA Server configuration, and then you can give a name to this configuration, and then you can just start that PA Server. The idea was you can launch multiple PA Server with a default port number easily to the PA Server Manager.
However, right now it is not backwards compatible. So with the PA Server Manager, you can have multiple instances of the PA Server, but you cannot launch XE6 or XE5 PA Server.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you set up currently the PA Server Manager for XE7 PA Server, so we cannot make it work for the older version of PA Server. So.
Okay, and PA servers are version specific, right? I mean, there was a PA server version for XE5, a PA server version for XE6, and now
That's
one
correct,
for XE7, and they have different version numbers.
They have a different version number, yeah.
Yeah.
That's how you can tell, yeah.
And if you're running the wrong one on the same port and you have a newer ID or vice versa, it will give you a message saying that there's a mismatch.
Yeah, ID will say, yeah, we cannot talk to this PA server, will say mismatch, yes. That's correct, yeah.
So Phyllis is asking, where are the debug DCUs? That's just a setting in the project manager, isn't it?
Yes, correct.
Under
project options.
Is it under linker or I don't know? Oh, shoot, where's my ID?
Yeah, I'd have to bring up the ID. Project options. Yeah.
Let's see. Project options.
Under debugging or something.
Let's see. Oh.
This is for
Debugger. Okay.
Or compiling or
Symbol tables. Yeah.
like a DCU or something.
Let me see. Link.
compiling, I think.
Oh, there is an option under C++ linker called full debug information. Let's see.
That's different.
Is that different? Oh.
That allows the compiler to generate additional information in the debug information.
Oh, okay.
It does not relate to the DCU.
I'm just trying to find that setting. Debugger. Working directory source path. So under project options debugger, there is where you can set the source path, directories, and so on. There's symbol table, environment block. Here I'm trying to find. We're all looking because we all. Let's see, full debug info. Okay.
That option may only be with Delphi.
Oh. We're all looking at. Okay, we'll find that. I mean, the debug. There are debug versions, libraries, and release depending on what you have for your build configuration, and those are in the in the lib folder.
For the that's a two thing, right? That's a build configuration for the project pane that will debug you'll build your program with the debug mode, and then the RTL debug information to link it in. For the Delphi will be under project option linked with DCU. For the C++, we still look at what the name of the option itself. So.
Oh, link with dynamic RTL.
It's under the project options, then Delphi compiler, then compiling, and then under the debugging, it's use debug.c DCUs.
Under linking?
Under compiling, under Delphi compiler.
Okay. So it's project options, Delphi compiler. Okay. Yeah. And compiling, right?
Yes.
And then the subsection. Oh, there it is, under debugging. Yep. Okay. Use debug. DCUs. And in my case, for my C++ target I generated, it's false. It's off by default. I did a file new project. Yeah. Okay. Is that Jim or David I talking now? So Jayton, you're in the C++ track, and I'm logged in as David I, but everyone who's talking, it'll say they're David I as well. So unless there's an external speaker who's connected that I turned over control to. So, and Phyllis, okay, found it. Great, thanks. Does CodeGuard work for FireMonkey on Win32? CodeGuard, I mean, turns on for your compiled C++ source code for your applications. There's CodeGuard information that is built in for your applications, but we didn't turn CodeGuard. We didn't generate CodeGuard information for all the different frameworks.
Correct. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a compile time option.
Yep. I suppose if you put a source file in your project and said build it with debug information or CodeGuard, it's compilable. So, but it's a compile time option for code you compile. And that should stop if you're using an object or memory. It'll stop in there's a CodeGuard window that pops up in the ID that'll tell you where certain things happen, like bad parameters to Windows APIs and other things. So if you want source RTL or framework code, include the source file in your project, and then it'll build that. Okay, that's a good one. And Phyllis says, thank you very much. I'm going to put a smiley there. We're near the top of the hour, so let's see if I missed anything. Oh, yeah. Brian also said where it was. Great. Thanks, Brian. So James is mentioning, I have noticed when debugging a large and complex application that after a number of breakpoints have been hit, maybe 20 or so, it'll get a memory error in the IDE. The app is too big to submit a bug report with.
Is this like a Win32? What platform is that?
Well, James went offline for a month. Maybe he'll come back on, but I'll. And again, when you have really large projects and you can't set a sort of as an attachment a set, try to boil it down. Yeah,
one thing if you can try would be try to close your local variable field and then see does it help or not, and then that will give up something. And also, does this happen in which version of X? Is that XE6, XE7, or something? That would be useful so we know which version that is happening.
Okay, we're past the top of the hour. I want to thank Kirill, who was online and was typing answers, and also Hin, Dawn, and Angel.